Hello, everyone. Welcome to our ITSS Verona member series on youth, peace, and security. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Balkis, and I'm the Human Security Team Lead here at the International Team for the Study of Security Verona. Today, we have a great guest with us, Mr. Saji Prelis, who is the Director of Children and Youth Programs at Search for Common Ground. He has over 25 years of experience working with youth movements in over 35 countries, and he has advised governments on ways to engage youth. He's also the co-chair of the Global Coalition on Youth, Peace and Security, and has co-led the successful advocacy of the UN Security Council resolutions on YPS, so Resolution 2250, Resolution 2419, and Resolution 2535. He has received the Distinguished Luxembourg Peace Prize for his outstanding achievements in peace support, and he obtained his master's in international peace and conflict resolution from the American University in DC. Mr. Saji, thank you so much for being with us today and for accepting the invitation. We wanted to start this quick interview with a question on the YPS agenda. So how did it come to be, and why is Resolution 2250 considered historic?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to speak with you today, Balkis, and really engaging me in this conversation. Also, I appreciate that you're talking about youth issues, and I appreciate you taking the leadership in understanding why and how and what the agenda means. So to go back to your question about why this agenda came about, what we wanted to do at the early stages was we wanted to change the political perspectives that were very common at the time. And the perspectives were young people as a problem or young people just as victims of conflict. And in the reality, that was not the case. So, and those myths, they were based on a set of myths and stereotypes about young people. And it was at the policy level, it was grounded in the response was grounded in a sense of policy panic. When young people are seen as a problem, a policy panic based approach saw young people as a problem and saw a set of responses from it. And what we want to do at a global level was shift away from a policy panic approach to a policy opportunity approach. So that's the beginnings of the why we wanted to do it. The how we did it actually was documented in a report called More Than a Milestone, The Road to Security Council Resolution 2250. But what I want to highlight here is the how was because it was over 11,000 young people from about 109 countries who actually shepherded that process through. It wasn't that the Security Council suddenly woke up to the reality that young people matter. It was young people who made the case that they matter and that they were sick and tired of being seen as a problem when they're actually in the front lines of preventing violence. So that story is important. But the other part of that story of how was the importance of the Kingdom of Jordan, who took the mantle of leadership in shepherding it. But the reason the Kingdom of Jordan took it also is because of young people who shaped the Amman, something called the Amman Declaration. It's the first official call to action by young people saying they need a global framework that recognizes their partnership in preventing violence. And that was the stewardship that Amman Kingdom of Jordan took forward from the Amman Declaration. But the other part of how I think is important to recognize is at the early stages, we asked the questions based on the policy panic was, why are young people joining armed groups? What are the push and pull factors towards violent extremism? So we at the global level, inspired by young people, wanted to ask a disruptive question, a very easy question, but difficult to answer. But in reality, it's actually very easy to answer. That new question that we wanted to ask was, why are most young people peaceful? We were not ignoring the others, but we wanted to ask was, why are young people peaceful in a country is surrounded by lots of reasons to be angry and frustrated and excluded? And that magic question is what was galvanized this agenda. Right? So to then answer the why 2250 is historic based on all these factors, I think firstly, I want to acknowledge that this agenda came about in 2015. when the resolution 2250 was adopted on December 9th. But it needs to be put in context. For hundreds of years, young people have been in the front lines of preventing violence, but being ignored and not recognized. So what UN Security Council Resolution 2250 adopted on December 9th does is that it for the first time recognizes the political agency of young people as core leaders and core partners in peace. It is historic because it's the first resolution that focused on the positive agency of young people, right? Not the negative agency. And that the Security Council was the first resolution of that nature. What it does is codifies how governments can respond to youthful populations. It codifies it around how through 5 pillars. And the 5 pillars are around participation, prevention, partnership, protection, and DDR, demobilization, rehabilitation, reintegration, and reinsertion into communities. And these 5 pillars are in every country around the world. It is not, and I think I need to emphasize that the Security Council resolution doesn't specialize that this is an issue that is happening only in the global south. This is an issue that is universal because young people feel excluded from society, whether it's in Finland or Canada or Australia or Democratic Republic of Congo or any other global south countries. So it's important to recognize that. But it's also historic because the resolutions don't stop at 2250. There are 2 additional resolutions that provide an enveloping way to think about youth leadership. Resolution 2419 in 2018 focuses on the important role that young people play in peace processes. And Resolution 2535 in 2020 recognizes that the leadership role young people are exercising is coming under increasing threat, and the civic and digital space they occupy is shrinking. And the importance of protecting and safeguarding that space was another recognition that the resolutions do. And collectively, these 3 resolutions do is make a case that young people are a political force for peace. So that's the historic nature of these resolutions.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. So when it comes to the challenges, what are, in your work in trying to implement the YPS agenda, what are the main challenges that you have come across?
Sure. So this is a very important question to kind of break it down. So in response to Resolution 2535, we actually created a global report called If I Disappear, a global report on protecting young people's civic space. What it did was it did a global survey around young people. What are the key barriers young people experience on a day-to-day basis? And what it did was it found, in order of their own importance, young people's own importance, that the biggest barrier they experience is sociocultural. Second is political. Third is financial, legal, digital, physical barrier. And then at the time also the pandemic was one of the biggest barriers. But if you fast forward it now, it's the other crises that are unfolding in people's lives. So when you think about barriers and challenges, those are those big barriers itself. When you think about addressing those barriers, we have to overcome these barriers that exist in our families, in our communities. The number one barrier to address it socioculturally is the concept of ageism, that young people are weak or not useful to society till they grow up. And this myth needs to be overcome culturally, socially, programmatically. At the political level, the biggest barrier is that young people are seen as a threat and a risk, and that needs to be overcome. At a financial level, current financial structures that support young people's leadership is broken and is deeply colonial in nature still. And we need to think of how to unleash that full potential of young people through financial investments that go beyond that distrust of young people itself. Same thing with digital itself. The digital spaces are shrinking. When the more young people feel connected, oftentimes people think, oh, young people use digital tools. But the more they are connected, the more they feel disconnected, the more they feel lonely, right? So the idea that digital is a magic wand is not actually true. It's the loneliness crisis that young people are experiencing also needs to be addressed. And the other is the legal and physical. When young people exercise their rights, the threats that they experience need to be addressed. So when you think about them holistically, we need to think of them in a way that enable them to overcome these barriers. That requires a generational or intergenerational approach. Young people alone cannot take on this responsibility or the burden. It requires an intergenerational and intersectional approach to overcome these barriers. And at the country level, the resolutions, what they do is provide that normative frameworks, but ultimately it requires the social, cultural, and political institutional commitments to act on these at the national level. And they are being done with various tools at the national level through national strategies and plans also. So it requires leadership across generations of adults and others to ask, what's the world that we want to be remembered? How do we want to be remembered by future generations? And how do we then as adults respond in a way that sees young people as partners? It's a question that helps us start thinking about the how itself to overcome these barriers.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering that. And so maybe on a final question, if you were to address youth, what do you think their activism in terms of youth inclusion, what should it focus on?
Um, So youth inclusion and representation, I think you can think about them in the same ways that I talked about those barriers. So one is the institutional level. How can institutions create policies and programs to respond to seeing young people as partners? For example, we saw the African Union responding by creating a 10-year action plan on their commitment as an institution level to see young people as partners and supporting national strategies now. Right? It requires institutional leadership to do that. At the policy level, at the country level, policy level, we need to think of national programs, national policies, national action plans, national services to become more youth inclusive and conflict sensitive to young people's growing concerns. So they're one of the policies that are shaping that decision at a governmental level are critical to think about. Programmatically, how can young people be seen as part of the process of a design, monitoring, evaluation, implementation, and communication of results and impact? There's another example here where we found that through us understanding what's the social and economic return of young people's work, we found that for every $1 invested, there's a $5 to $10 return on that investment. What it just shows is the return on that investment is not just for young people, but the return on investment is for women's organizations, religious organizations, the community. The state institutions benefit when young people's peace building work succeeds. And the private sector also benefits economically when young people's peace building work succeeds. So what we see from this study is that when we invest in young people, there's a $5 to $10 return, but the $5 to $10, the impact is not just on young people itself. Their work impacts society writ large, including the private sector and the government and community groups. So we think about investment in financing, then we need to ask ourselves, how do we think about young people? Did we finance that in a way that makes young people thrive more? So that would suggest that those are some of the ways to think about inclusion and representation of young people through those processes.
Great, thank you so much for sharing. And I'm sorry my camera isn't on; it completely froze. Yeah, and then I wanted to end maybe on a word of hope and optimism for young people who are listening to us today. What would you tell them? Just a word of hope to share with them.
Maybe 5 key messages. One is keep doing what you're doing because it is starting to work. It is starting to work because people are starting to pay attention. Second is the leadership model that you have. Young people tend to embrace a horizontal leadership model, and that's important for their way of organizing that is networked. But we need to communicate that so others can understand that this horizontal leadership model is not a leader-less model, but a leader-full model. So that needs to be communicated. Third, I think as life gets tougher, the world young people are going to inherit is going to be much more chaotic. We know that. But we need young people who can convene young people and other adult interlocutors in a way that convenes people to collectively address the world that young people are inheriting. right? This issue that young people are inheriting is something they are inheriting, but the solutions cannot be put on the shoulders and backs of young people to carry. This is an issue that generationally we need to address across adult and young generations together. So young people need to act as conveners, not just recipients, but conveners across generations to tackle these big problems together. Fourth is we see a lot of around the world that young people criticize bad leadership, and that is justified. But when young people inherit positions, they practice the same bad leadership qualities also. So let's truth be told, if young people are criticizing poor leadership, when they get opportunities to be leaders in their communities and organizations, we want them to chart a new path of leadership that inspires other generations of young people to be like them and act like them. And that's an important message too. And the last thing, run for office. Run for office and create the systems that are much more inclusive, more age inclusive, gender inclusive, intersectional inclusive, and be part of that revolution that is required to really change the broken systems that we have internationally and nationally, and do it in a way that is not adversarial, collaborative, so that we collectively, intergenerationally, we will feel the impact of the collective work that we have in front of us.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. Yeah, and I was actually going to add that on your last point on running for office, I also think policy making is one of the most efficient ways where we can implement YPS and include youth in a lot of the work that we're doing. Thank you so much again for joining us. I'm sure this will be helpful to a lot of people, especially given a quick background on YPS for those who are interested in it. We'll be sharing this with everyone soon. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Marcos.